We are continuing in our limud of chapter 89, halacha number 3 in Yoreh Deah. We are continuing our discussion of this machlekes between the Mechaber and the Ramah. The Beis Yosef holds, as we saw in Sif Gimel, that there is a leniency by a cooked food that contains meat and a cooked food that contains cheese, and we are going to continue in discussing that because the Mechaber is lenient that there's no waiting period between those two. One simply should just wash between them, especially when it contains only cheese. And the Ramah says you have to wait a lot of time, and we saw that was because the assumption is that there's actually quite a bit of meat in the tavshil shel basar. And we're going to look at today what's the difference between a meat tavshil, a meat cooked thing, and a dairy one, okay? And if there's the waiting period for a cooked dairy product and then having meat, and then having a meat cooked thing and then cheese, and washing your hands and rinsing out your mouth. Okay, so we mentioned in the Gemara previously that we said that that when you wash your hands in the middle of a meal, this is a nice thing to do, but it's not required. And then we also quoted Rav Nachman that you have to wash between the two tavshils, right? This cooked thing and that cooked thing. Okay, if you have a cooked thing and then you have the actual thing itself, like a cooked thing of meat and then cheese, one has to wash the hands. Okay, you got to wash the hands. All right. Okay. So back in Tosfos, we saw that there was some requirements. So we're going to go look deeper into that Tosfos here. So there is the opinion of the Rabbeinu Shmuel in there. Okay. And we said that the permissive stance is when they are two cooked things. One is a meat cooked thing. One's a dairy cooked thing. It has cheese in it. That's cooked thing. Okay. So if you have a meat cooked thing going into cheese, when we say that's an obligation, we don't have that obligation when you go from cheese to anything else. So you would have to go ahead because if you had gone to another meal, you have to still wash your hands in order to go ahead into another case. We saw that in If Bays, we learned that a little bit earlier. Okay, but for meat, you cannot eat the cheese thing after without the washing your hands. That's the Rabbeinu Shmuel. And Rabbeinu Tam holds that when you have a cooked thing that's meaty and you're going to have cheese, it's implied that you're having a meat thing, and you may have to wait between one and the other. But we're saying in this statement that you don't have to. Okay, so we were saying that we may have to wait between cheese and meat, meaning go from one meal to another. But if they were cooked in pots, and it's not the actual thing itself, it's not actual meat, actual cheese, and it's cooked with them. So what's the requirement to cook? You're not touching it. That's Rabbeinu Tam's question. So he says instead that when our Gemara says you have to wait between two cooked items, it's meaning a meat cooked item to a cheese cooked item, okay? And we don't see any meat or any cheese in them. Okay, you only taste them, and we were talking about this a little bit with the Shach last time. Okay, that he says that there's some leniency by the Ramah. If you don't have like a little bit stuck on the inside, and then we had Rabbi Akiva Eger and other people who were said no, that's not the case. There's no time. So the Rabbeinu Tam is saying over here is we're not so strict to require washing your hands when there's just a little bit of flavor. We just said that this is a nice thing to do. Okay, but if you're going to eat the actual thing, okay, then you have to wash your hands. If you're going to actually eat cheese after having a meaty soupy thing. Okay, and that's even according to people who are saying that you can't have cheese after meat within that same meal. Okay, and that's even with the washing. So that's what he says. So we see for Rabbeinu Shmuel and Rabbeinu Tam, the Gemara is talking about two cooked things. Okay, and we want to make sure that you have to wash in between the meat thing and the dairy thing. And that's what he's talking about. Okay? And the Rabbeinu Tam is saying that you're going to go from meat to then a meaty thing to then a cheesy thing. Okay? But it's talking about whether or not there's actual stuff in there. And here we're talking about just flavor. So when there's actual stuff that you're going to touch, you have to wash your hands. Okay? If you're going to touch cheese, you're going to touch meat, those things you have to wash your hands. Okay? So when we said that you're having a meaty cooked thing, and then you're going to have cheese. So now that you're going to have actual cheese and you're going to put your hands on it, you have to wash your hands. Okay? And that would be true in the converse as well. So the Torah in Peites over here says that the Rush, his father, says that our custom is not to eat cheese after meat, okay, and not even after fowl like chicken, and this is when you were eating them at the same time, okay, in the same meal, or them themselves, excuse me. You're having actual chicken or actual beef and actual cheese, like one's here and one's there, okay. But when you're having the tavshil, when you're having something that's cooked with it, right? So you could have immediately afterwards a tavshil gvina, okay? And even washing your hands is only a permissible thing. But if you're going to have cheese after that, it's still permitted as long as you wash your hands, okay? So that's what they're talking about. So how does the Ramah get to his thing? So what is the reason for the difference between having cheese after a meaty soup and having a cheesy soup after a meaty soup? What's the difference? Why is the Gemara, this simple little Gemara, have this little thing? So Rabbeinu Tam is saying that it wasn't actually there to touch it. You can't touch the cheese, you can't touch the meat, but when you're going to actually touch it, that's what it comes down to. So the body of Shulchan asks an interesting question, and he says that it's like there's something missing out of this. So he wants to argue that having the flavor in it, the chiddush is, meaning the novelty here is that having the flavor in it is like having the meat, except that it's not actually there. Okay, so meaning you can't still have it. But it's not like the Torah doesn't prohibit eating. Let's say you took something that was not kosher and cooked it in something, and you ate that thing, right? Something non-kosher fell into a soup, and you then taste the non-kosher thing in the soup. So eating the soup, while prohibited by Torah law, is not going to be at the same level of eating the non-kosher thing, because the novelty is that you're not allowed to eat it while you're still allowed to taste it. So what we're saying over here is we're extending from that thought process to here. So if you're getting the flavor, then you're not allowed to have it. Okay? And he says this is actually in the halachic sefer, the Or Zarua, right? The famous V'nei Zohav, the Or Zarua. He says that since both of them are only flavor, that's why you aren't washing your hands. Okay? And so we say that that's like it's weaker than the actual thing. And he says according to the body of Shulchan that when you have a flavor here and a flavor there, no one's washing their hands on that. Okay. He also says he also quotes Rabbi Akiva Eger over here that the prohibition of eating meat and dairy one after the other, being rabbinic, is only when they are, since those things themselves are only prohibited when they are cooked. And here, when you have two cooked things, each one of themselves are not the actual thing themselves. And since it's a much weaker flavor, it would be too strict to require washing like you would by the regular thing. So it's an interesting chiddush in our sugya. Okay? So that's basically what we say, is that the flavors are kind of weak in the pots. Now, we're gonna learn later on in the next siman, okay, that there's a machlokas by when you cook the flavors get a little bit weak. That when they are cooking into each other immediately, when they are cooking with each other immediately, so if you take a dairy spoon and put it into fleshig pot. So that's a little bit more problematic, either because the spoon is dirty, so you can't say it's a small flavor. It's the actual thing itself, or we say it's because they're mixing together in the water, and that's not what the leniency was of weakened flavors. Okay, so that's not such a strong thing. So that's what he argues from the Or Zarua, but this doesn't really hold on. So the Pri Megadim actually says that the reason why is because maybe going from one food to another food is an actual problem. So if you have milk in there and meat in there, even if they're in water, the flavors are stronger, and so therefore the rabbis didn't want to extend a case of where it's not the full flavor. Right, you pull the meat out of the cooked thing, and you pull the meat out of the cheese thing, which we haven't really been talking about very specifically in our discussion until now. So when those aren't really there, it's not such a big deal. So this kind of echoes back to the Shach saying that if it's just a little bit dirty, the plate is a little bit dirty, you don't have to wait the 6 hours we were talking about in our previous year. But when the actual thing is there and the actual stuff is there, you may have to wait 6 hours. So that's that thought process. And according to others who didn't argue with that, it has to be completely clean, which is more like the stringent opinion in the next Simon Sadi, that say that way. But these are all thought processes that don't really affect the actual outcome. Let's look at the actual halacha as brought down in the actual words of the Mechaber and the Rama. Zok de Mechaber. The Mechaber says that when you eat a cooked meaty thing, you may have a cooked dairy cheesy thing after that. And washing your hands is only a permissive thing. Okay? And again, the Ramah doesn't say that. He says you have to wash your hands. Okay? Because he quotes that name of other Ashkenazi authorities. But if you're going to have cheese itself after the cooked thingy, which is a meat cookie thingy, or the other way around, you have to wash your hands. Okay? The Ramah says that having any fatty products, like even the fat of the meat in there, is like having meat in there. And the custom is to be strict and not to eat cheese afterwards, even though it's that. You have to wait between them. And you should not be lenient on this waiting. So you can't just wait. You can't have it in that same meal. You have to have it in another meal. And again, we talked about the Ramah holds that will only be, you have to have another meal, you have to wait an hour. The other Achronim hold that to be 6 hours. Okay, and we talked about if it's 6 or 5 and 1 and 5.5. Now, if there's not actual meat in there, okay, it's just cooked in a fleshig pot, a meaty pot. Okay, so then you can have cheese after that. Okay, and there's no minhag to be stringent on that, and that is our custom. Okay, just like having a cooked thing after cheese or milk. Okay, so we say you don't have to wash your hands, just like Mechaber holds. If you're going to go ahead and have meat itself, if you're having a cheesy thing, if you are touching something, okay, you have to wash your hands, but you don't have to wash your hands otherwise. Okay, and then the waiter thing is the last thing we'll talk about that. Okay, so the Mechaber holds like Rabbeinu Tam, and the Ramah holds Rabbeinu Shmuel, right? Shmuel, okay, he holds like him. Okay, so that if you eat something first that has meaty thingies in it, you're going to have to wait. Okay, so the Mechaber, so the opinion of the Beis Yosef, he says that you can eat one after the other. So the Taz explains that the dispute there is whether you have a clear soup. Okay, so like you've cooked it and the actual broth itself is clear. Okay, it's just that it's been cooked with meat. That's what we're talking about. That. Okay. So that's the question. The Pri Megadim says that if you are strict about this, that is permitted. And the Madanei Shulchan says over here that if you have a thick mix, okay, a thick mix of grains, let's say, and you cooked it with some milk, so the milk gets absorbed into it. So that is a tav shel gavina, so like oatmeal, for example. Okay, that would be permitted according to the Mechaber to have that after your tav shel basar. Okay, love. If I haven't expressed before, I love the Matneh Shulchan because it just gives you such concrete examples of what that feels like. So when the Chaber says that you're having cheese afterwards, you have to wash your hands. So there are some opinions over here, like the Aruch HaShulchan and the Chagura Shmuel, who I only know from, I didn't see the Sefer itself, I saw this adjacently, that he's saying you have to wash your hands, but don't really need to rinse out your mouth. Okay, so the problem is the touching, but not the eating. Bali Shulchan says, no, you have to rinse out your mouth too. Now the Ramah says that you have to wash your hands is because you are absolutely required to do that. And so therefore you have to also rinse out your mouth. Okay? And so that's what we kind of mentioned that in the Ramah itself. So according to the Ramah, so are you required to rinse out your mouth, or is it just like nice to do it or not? So Rabbi Kiva Eger asks that question, and he says that the Ramah says that you may not need to do all of that, because when he says that you shouldn't eat cheese after a meat soupy thing, a tavshil shel basar, so it's the cheese itself, okay? But if you're having a cheesy soup, and then you have the meat after the meaty thing, you don't have to wash your hands. So the Ramah also says himself in his own Sefer Torah Chatas, and he quotes an authority who lived right around his time, the Minchas Yaakov, and they say that a meat cooked item, if you want to have cheese afterwards, you have to also rinse. Okay, so wash and rinse. But if you have a cheesy one and a meat one, the only requirement is washing the hands. Okay, and the Minchas Yaakov also quotes the contemporary of the Marshal that the minhag is actually to do all of that. Okay, so that's what he says. So even though the Ramah is Mekel, the Marshal says no, we just don't. The minhag is not to do otherwise. So in effect, the Ramah is right on the din, but the minhag is to be strict on that. So some people want to understand why is the Ramah lenient over here. I don't think that's important. So the reason would be is because he holds like the Rashbam, like we saw, the Rabbeinu Shmuel. And many people hold like that opinion, that you only have to wash your hands. And so, it's not like a super stringent thing. And especially since Rabbeinu Tam was only saying that you required washing your hands as well, so he didn't feel a need to be more strict than even the lenient opinion, which is like the Mechaber holds of Rabbeinu Tam. When you say, according to the Mechaber, however, do you have to also rinse out? So we say that although you had to rinse your hands, you have to wash your hands, you don't have to rinse out your mouth. Okay, and that was what the Aruch HaShulchan says. Okay, and the Badei Shulchan disagrees. But again, Badei Shulchan likes to bring all the chumras. So let's go over these rules over here about having one after the other with washing the hands. So in the Gemara, we saw that between Tavshil and Tavshil you don't, and between Tavshil and Gvina you have to. So Rabbeinu Shmuel, the Rashbam, he says the Gemara is talking about you have two cooked things, meaty, and two things cheesy, right? And Rav Nachman is saying that when you have a cheesy thing and then you want to have something else, you then have to wash your hands because you're going to go into a meaty thing. Okay, but if you have a meaty thing first and then you have a cheesy thing first, you have to wash your hands. Okay, and that's a requirement because it's almost like having cheese afterwards. But the Rabbeinu Tam was saying no, that you have a meaty soup and a cheesy soup, and since the meat isn't there, there's no requirement to wash. But when you see actual meat and actual cheese, then you have to wash your hands. And so when we said that was a cooked soup from meat to cheese, since you see the cheese, that's the obligation, okay? And it's also the same thing, if you have the cheesy soup and you're going to have meat afterwards, you could then have it, okay? So this also talks about where as we talked about in the last year and continuing this year, is when you actually have actual meat and actual cheese inside of the tavshil himself. But the actual meat inside of the thing is part of the machlekes. So Tosfos is basically saying, according to Rabbeinu Tam, that the meat and the cheese are not there at all. You just have the flavor. and therefore there's no obligation to do the washing when you just look and you see nothing there. So the Mechaber takes Rabbeinu Tam at his word that since that there's no meat, no cheese in it that you can see, and you only have the flavor, there's no obligation to wash your hands, and there's also no obligation to wait as well. Okay, and even if there's cheese after this meaty thing, it's permitted immediately, and only the cheese itself is saying that you have an obligation to do that. The Ramah holds like this Rashbam, and he says that you first had the meaty thing, and you can't have the cheesy thing afterwards. Even with washing your hands, okay, because you're having cheese after meat, and if one who has meat after a cheesy soup or after milk, you need to wash your hands. So we see over here we're continuing the same dispute over here, and even according to Mechaber, it seems that the Taz is saying that if there's actually a lot of flavor in it, you should be strict. And really, the only leniency was to say that it became a fleshig soup. But most people don't agree with that thing. So in our next class, we're going to talk about sharing a tablecloth for these things, which will take us into Sif Daled. Okay, and Sif Daled is where we basically say that you're going to have cheese and then meat. So how do you go from one meal to another? And especially since Shavuos is coming up, we'll try to get that class up ASAP. Thank you for joining our class today. We hope you have enjoyed our little romp through Yoreh Deah. See you next time.